Hello everyone and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name's Rhiannon and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in October. Now, I do just quickly want to apologise about the lighting. It's a Saturday today, I've had a very busy morning, and by the time I got ready and sat down to film, it was 4 o'clock and it was already getting dark outside. It's now 5, I have filmed one video before this, and by this point now it is completely dark outside. So we are relying on my ring light and the lamp and light of this room. So again, I do apologise, but if I didn't sit down to film this now, I honestly never would, because I have 12 books here to talk about today, which is insane for me, and you guys know how much I tend to ramble on in these wrap-ups, so I'm gonna try and keep my reviews short and sweet. And so without further ado, let's see what I read in October. The first book I finished was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I listened to the audiobook for this off of your guys' recommendation, and I'm so glad that I did, because I flew through this book and I really did enjoy it. For those of you who don't know, this is a classic that was written in the 1800s, and in it we follow a young man named Dorian Gray. Now, one day he decides to get his portrait painted, and whilst he is sitting for his portrait, he meets another man who kind of opens his eyes to all of the bad things in the world, and Dorian then strays away from the path of good in a way and ends up committing a lot of moral sins. Now, at first he's mortified by his actions, however he soon realises that every act that he commits is reflected onto his painting rather than himself, and so he doesn't really face the consequences of his actions after that point. He does what he wants to without thinking of anyone else, and he is never personally affected, so he does keep this portrait locked away, because of course if anyone saw that it would be the most hideous thing ever and they would have a lot of questions. It just says here, the picture of Dorian Gray is a masterpiece of the evil in men's hearts and is as controversial and alluring as Wilde himself. As I mentioned, I did listen to the audiobook of this and I did give it 4 stars. I had a really good time with this one. I feel like it's definitely an easier classic to dive into. I previously read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, I want to say about 2 years ago, and I was so confused with that book, but this one is definitely easier to follow, and I feel like even though it was written quite a while ago, it's not too jarring. This book started off all nice and well, and then it took such a dark turn. I feel like Dorian Gray changes very quickly, and you can see the effect that has on himself and also on other people around him, and the consequences of his actions do come back to haunt him in a way. But that was the point that I had an issue, because it seems like there's a threat and it seems like he is going to pay for what he has done, but then this threat just ends up being non-existent and Dorian gets away with something once again, and I just feel like that was a little unsatisfying. And as well as that, I feel like the ending was so rushed. I didn't even realise that this book had finished until it got to the point where it was like, you have finished this audiobook, please go ahead and give it a rating, and I was like, oh, that's a bit weird. But those are my main gripes with it. It was a good story. I see why it's such a popular classic. I'm very glad that I read it because it definitely has those dark gothic vibes that were perfect for October. And again, a massive thank you to you guys for suggesting that I listen to the audiobook, because I had a really good time consuming the story that way. The next book I read was Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerry Maniscalco, and this is a YA adult fantasy series, but I believe that the second and third books are more adult, and I feel like that is what was missing for me in this book, which I will go into in a second. But in case you don't know, this is Kerry Maniscalco's newest series. She is the author of the Stalking Jack the Ripper series, which I will be mentioning in a minute. But in this one we follow twins Amelia and Vittoria, and they are both young girls living in Italy who work in the family's restaurant. Now, the only difference is that they are actually witches. Now, they are aware of the danger that comes with being a witch, and so that is why they mainly work at the family's restaurant, is to kind of hide themselves away and avoid persecution. However, one night Vittoria doesn't come home, and when Amelia goes in search of her, she unfortunately finds the dead body of her twin sister. Of course, Amelia is absolutely devastated, and when she finds the body, she vows that she will do anything in her power in order to avenge her sister's death. And this is where dark magic starts to come in now, because Amelia summons Wrath, who is a prince of hell, and Wrath claims to be on Amelia's side because he has actually been tasked by his master to figure out who is killing these young women, because it's not only Vittoria who has been killed, but there have been a few other victims as well, and so he's there to kind of figure out what's going on and put a stop to it. However, when it comes to the wicked, nothing is as it seems, and we follow Amelia, of course, in her journey through her grief as she comes to terms themes with her sister's death, but as she also goes deeper and deeper into herself and her emotions in order to find out what she's actually capable of. This is another one I thoroughly enjoyed. I did give it 4 stars, not the full 5, just because I feel like the writing in this was very juvenile, which is a bit of a shock to me because I have read from Cara Maniscalco before, and that was her debut novel, which again will pop up in a minute, but the writing in that seems a lot more well thought out and complex than it was in this book, and at some points it feels like the author wasn't quite sure where to go with the plot and our characters, and I feel like that shone through, which was a bit of a shame, and I just feel like it was a little bit disjointed. I loved the setting though. The food in this made me want to go to Italy again because oh my goodness you guys, it sounded amazing, and you know Italian food is some of the best food out there. The atmosphere as well was done perfectly. I love Wrath and Amelia's dynamics, but I also liked the introduction of different characters as well, and it always seemed like the level of danger in here was extremely high, though again another gripe is that our main character somehow managed to get out of these situations pretty quickly, so I am hoping that with the next 2 books being adult they will be a lot more high stakes and it will be a lot more complicated, which is what I do enjoy in my books. All in all though, this is such a fun read. I see why people love it so much. I'm really glad that I have now started this series because I cannot wait to continue and find out what is going on, because the way this book ended was just crazy, and I've heard that it gets a lot darker and a lot spicier as well, so I'm definitely here for it. I'm hoping that my rating only goes up for the next 2 books as well, and I'm definitely in my fantasy romance era now guys. I am wanting to consume all of the fantasy romance books, and so starting off with this one was fantastic, and I'm really glad that I've read it now. Nothing is going right today guys. My camera did just run out of battery, so I have had to switch that out, so apologies if anything looks different. But the next book I then picked up was All Our Hidden Gifts by Caroline O'Donoghue, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I picked this up on a whim just because I wanted another audiobook to listen to after finishing The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I'm so glad that I did because I really enjoyed this one. In this one we follow our main character Maeve, who one day finds an old pack of tarot cards in her school. She doesn't know anything about tarot, however she does pick them up and decides to give someone a reading, and this reading turns out to be scarily accurate, and so a lot more people start demanding readings from her, but when she's forced to give a reading to her ex-best friend Lily, something goes wrong because a rogue card pops up in the middle of the reading, and it's one that Lily chooses, and after this happens both of them have a bit of an argument and then Lily ends up disappearing. It does take a few days until people start to genuinely worry, and the longer and longer Lily is missing for, Maeve knows that there's something darker to this and that it is probably linked to her tarot reading. And it just says here, only the cards and something older, something even more powerful can bring her back. As I mentioned, I listened to the audiobook of this, which I would highly recommend. It is on script, as is the 2nd and 3rd book as well. The narrator was brilliant. She was so comedic, and I feel like she portrayed each and every character so well, especially our main character Maeve, because sometimes it is hard to be in Maeve's head. She is very hard done by, and she doesn't realise how privileged she is at some points. However, I feel like the narrator put that across very well, and even though you can tell that she is young and that she has a lot of mistakes to make before realizing that the world isn't as she's always seen it, and the other characters in here as well were so important. There is a black main character, we also have a non-binary character who is trying to figure out their identity, and the conversations between all of them and the issues that were raised were very powerful, and I feel like they were very well done. Of course I can't speak on the representation, however I felt like it was extremely powerful and I got something out of this, and our main character Maeve does as well, because as I mentioned, she is somewhat unaware of what is going on around her, and so when these characters are trying to voice these injustices and why they feel like some things are wrong in the world, we see Maeve then kind of come to terms with that and realise that, oh yeah, I've had it pretty easy, these guys are having a hard time of it. And so I really appreciated that. I loved the atmosphere in this. It was so creepy, and even though, as I mentioned, this is a very humorous book, it just balanced really well so that you had the humorous moments but then you also had the darker, creepier moments, and I feel like that is what I need. I need a break from the scary every now and again, and so the comedic relief in this was definitely something I appreciated, and I think it's why I enjoyed it so much. I feel like it just had a bit of everything, and if you guys have read Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson, I feel like this is very similar, so you would probably enjoy this book if you enjoyed that one. I did. I read it a few months ago now and just loved my experience with that book. I think I gave that first book 4 stars. stars, and I also gave this first book 4 stars. It didn't quite hit the 5-star feel for me. I feel like, again, this one wrapped up pretty quickly, but I'm excited to see where we go from here. I have downloaded the next 2 audiobooks on Scribd, and I also have downloaded the next book in the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series, which I can't remember what the name of it is off the top of my head. Is it the Shadow Cabinet? I feel like it's the Shadow Cabinet. So anyway, I have all of them downloaded because I just can't get enough. So I will be carrying on with this series and HMRC as well. And yeah, as I mentioned, this was such a good time. I personally don't know anything about tarot, and I don't feel like you need to. I feel like it's very well explained without being a rule book in a way. And you see tarot through different characters' eyes as well. You see it through Maeve, who is learning, but you also see it from a shopkeeper who specializes in the supernatural. And so different elements just came together to make it believable and make it a very interesting story. And even though I picked this up completely on a whim, I'm so glad that I did, because yeah, it's a very enjoyable book and I can't wait to see where our characters go from here. Then another audiobook I listened to was Halloween Party by Agatha Christie. This was a reread for me, and I did end up giving it 3 stars. I can't quite remember the rating I gave this the first time round. I feel like it would have been pretty similar, but I did read that physically the first time on my Kindle, and as I mentioned, I listened to the audiobook this time around. Now, I love the audiobooks for Agatha Christie's works. That is how I consume these stories now. I don't think I've read one physically ever since I started reading her books consistently, and so going into this one I was very excited because I had just watched A Haunting in Venice, so I did know who the culprit was, but I knew that A Haunting in Venice was very differently staged to what was actually going on in this book, and it definitely was. It was really cool to be able to compare the two. Again, I had read this before, so I knew it was a bit different, but reading this one just after seeing the new film was a really cool experience, and yeah, it just highlighted the creative liberties that filmmakers take, because even though the film was based off of this story, after the first kind of chapter or 2, they went in a completely different direction, and so sitting back down to listen to this was very fun, especially of course in October we are leading up to Halloween, and this book does take place at a Halloween party for children. At this Halloween party we have a young girl called Joyce who claims to have seen a murder. However, no one believes her. Joyce is known as being a liar, and so nobody thinks much of it. They kind of move on from that and continue on with the rest of the fun things that they plan on doing in this party. But when Joyce is then found drowned in the apple bopping tub, questions are raised about what she actually saw. And it just says here, set against a night of trickery and the occult, Hercule Poirot and Ariadne Oliver must race to uncover the real evil responsible for this ghastly murder. Now, the plot itself is fine. It's not something that will stick with me. It's not one of Agatha Christie's best books in my personal opinion, but I had an amazing time listening to this because I was reading it as part of Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin's Patreon, and he did a Christie Crime and Wine night where he was reading this book, trying to solve it, and then he also has a vlog out now where he filmed a reading vlog for this book, and it contained all of his theories and his reactions, and it's honestly one of the best things ever. I love Gavin's Agatha Christie videos, or rather Sluggatha Christie as he is known. But yeah, I had a really good time reading it alongside Gavin and his Patreons, and then of course watching the live show and seeing where his theories took him. Of course I'm not going to spoil anything, but that was definitely what made this book a lot more enjoyable for me. Other than that, I feel like it's pretty long, and as I mentioned, it's not my favourite Agatha Christie, but I'm glad to have read it. I love that I read it in October with Gavin as Patreons, and because of that, it is an experience that will stick with me. Next up, we have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and this is the beautiful Fairy Loot edition. Now, so many people have been raving about this book ever since it came out, and so I was definitely apprehensive to dive into this at first, but again, I'm really glad that I did. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, I want to say, but on Goodreads I rounded it up to a 4. I of course enjoyed it, but I don't think I enjoyed it as much as everyone else seemed to, and that is probably down to my personal taste. I feel like we could have gotten so much more from this book, but I understand why it was told the way it was and why it wasn't as fleshed out in some points. So essentially, this novel focuses on Dracula's first bride, Constanta, and it shows her from the moment that she is turned up until the moment that she severs ties with Dracula. I think I will read you the synopsis for this one because it's just such a difficult book to describe. It says, saved from the brink of death by a mysterious stranger, Constanta is transformed from a medieval peasant into a bride fit for an undying king. But when Dracula draws a cunning aristocrat and a starving artist into his web of passion and deceit, Constanta realizes that her beloved is capable of terrible things. Finding comfort in the arms of her rival consorts, she begins to unravel their husband's dark dark secrets. With the lives of everyone she loves on the line, Constanta will have to choose between her own freedom and her love for her husband. But bonds forged by blood can only be broken by death. S.T. Gibson's sensational novel is the darkly seductive tale of Dracula's first bride. I feel like one of the main things about this novel is the relationship between our characters. I feel like that was so well done, and it was so interesting to see all of these different personalities come together in such unfortunate circumstances and see them kind of fade as time goes on, because of course they are immortal. They were made immortal by Dracula, so they feel like they have some sort of loyalty to him, and when Dracula first meets them, they are all so fiery and passionate, and they just want to live their lives, see everything, go everywhere. And then slowly we see how Dracula mentally and emotionally abuses them, and he gets them to a point where they're not allowed to leave and they have to follow his every rule. There are actually a bunch of trigger warnings in here that I will read out because I feel like it's important for you guys to know. So we do have an author's note that just says, "This book winds through some dark places and I want readers to be able to opt in or opt out at their leisure. So I've provided the following content guidance. A Dowry of Blood contains depictions of emotional, verbal and physical intimate partner abuse, gaslighting, war, famine and plague, blood and gore, consensual sexual content, sadomasochism, self-harm, body horror, violence and murder, alcohol use, depression and mania." And then it does also say here, it also contains brief references to sexual assault not directed at any named character, drug use and drowning. So that is definitely something I appreciated before diving into this, and it is definitely a very hard-hitting novel as we see our characters get to some very low points and we're seeing what they're having to deal with day to day. I really love the way that this is told as well. So essentially it's Constanta writing to Dracula, which is really interesting, and so she kind of gets out all the things that she's been wanting to say and she puts it down onto paper, and we as readers then read her account. So it is a little bit one-sided, but I feel like it's the best way the story could be told. We obviously know so much about Dracula, but maybe not as much about his consorts, and so I love what S.T. Gibson did. It was a very dark, gothic, atmospheric book, and it is definitely one that I would recommend if you want that type of novel and want to know more about Dracula, because it's beautifully written. I really did enjoy it. I just don't think I loved it as much as everyone else seems to have loved it. Next up, I read Stalking Jack the Ripper by Kerri Maniscalco. This is the other Kerri Maniscalco book that I was on about earlier, and I'm so happy to say that I really enjoyed this book. The last time I read this one was 5 years ago when it first came out, I believe, or it was just as the second book was coming out, because I remember starting the second book, I got about 2 chapters in and I put it down for some reason and never picked it back up again. This time around though, I feel like I enjoyed it more than I did the first time. I had such an amazing time reading this book, and that may be because it is to do with Jack the Ripper, if you couldn't tell. So in this one we are following our main character Audrey Rose, and ever since the death of her mother she has been fascinated by the human body and what happens to the human body after death. Her uncle is a forensic scientist and she apprentices under him and starts to study medicine and biology, and ultimately then she starts to help him with his post-mortem examinations. Now when a series of murders start occurring and they are all attributed to Jack the Ripper, Audrey Rose is drawn into the case as she is desperate to find out who this person is and why he is killing these young women. But to her horror, in her search for clues, this draws her very close to home, and she is starting to get suspicious of a lot of people around her. That's all I'm gonna say. I don't know if I've described it all that well, but it's such a good book. Again, it's very dark and atmospheric, as you can tell by the subject matter. We are dealing with murders, and it does go into detail about murders and different afflictions in this age, and throughout we do actually have some pictures as well that go with what is happening in the chapters. So for example, chapter 1 we have a photo of a body and someone cutting into the body. Now you can't actually see them cutting in, but just a warning, that is the type of content that is scattered in throughout this book. I personally really appreciated it because it did tie into the story and you could reference back to it. Sometimes it's photos of places and that is really useful of course, and other times it's afflictions such as tubercular leprosy. So there are photos to go with the descriptions of what certain people are going through in this, which again is very harrowing but very effective. perspective. I can't remember if I mentioned, but I gave this 4 stars. It didn't quite get the 5-star feeling for me, just because at some points in this book I felt like it was very difficult to carry on reading. Not in terms of the content, but in terms of the pacing. I feel like sometimes it just dragged on a bit too much, and I felt myself being forced to carry on reading, because otherwise I'd put it back down and then kind of forget about it. But at the moments where this was faster paced, I was so engrossed in the story and what was going on. Our character relationships in here as well are some of the best ones I've read. Not only the romantic relationships, but also the paternal ones, and I just all round had a really good time with this one. I didn't quite get the 5-star feeling with it, unfortunately. Off 2 families that were at opposite ends of the United States, and so they shouldn't know about each other. However, one day Dodger pops into Roger's head and has a full-blown conversation with him out of the blue, and we see how their relationship develops from there. Now, I will read you a bit of the synopsis, because this is the part that lost me a bit. It says, Roger and Dodger aren't exactly human, though they don't realise it. They aren't exactly gods either. Not entirely, not yet. Meet Reed, skilled in the alchemical arts like his progenitor before him. Reed created Dodger and her brother. He's not their father, not quite, but he has a plan. To raise the twins to the highest power, to ascend with them and claim their authority as his own. Godhood is attainable, pray it isn't attained. So Reed is an alchemist, and he is the one who created Roger and Dodger based on someone else's original work. And after reading this book, I still don't quite know what the point of them was. This is a mix of sci-fi and fantasy, but it's also set in our world, so it's more of an urban fantasy. And I feel like this is why I don't gel with sci-fi that well, because everything seems to be going over my head. I feel like I could follow along with the story very well, and I feel like I knew what was happening with Roger and Dodger and who their friends were and what was actually going on in both their lives. However, the actual scientific elements to this book were lost on me. There was a lot of different time jumps and timelines. We went back in time, we went forward in time, we reset time a few times as well, and there were just some things that I feel like were too confusing for me. And I am a high fantasy reader, guys. I love the nitty-gritty details in my book, but I just feel like this one, because of the added sci-fi element, lost me a little bit. I can see why people love this book, and I know it's meant to be confusing, but I finished this book and I still couldn't tell you what the main plot of it is and why these twins were made. So that is basically why I've given it that rating. I know it's a pretty low rating considering this is a favourite book of a lot of people, but unfortunately it just wasn't completely for me, which is fine. I loved the character relationships, as I mentioned, and the character moments that we got in here. Seeing Roger and Dodger's struggles was so difficult, but then seeing how they always had each other was so heartwarming. It was so well done. I definitely feel like the familial relationship in here was so strong, and it's definitely the element that kept me glued to this book. Again, I listened to this on audio. I would highly recommend the audiobook because the narrator was fantastic. I feel like going back, I would probably read this book alongside listening to the audiobook, just because I feel like I would retain a lot more information that way. So if I ever do reread this, that's probably the route I will take. But yeah, I had an amazing time listening to it, but that may be a reason that I didn't retain as much information as I should have. Then moving on from that, I did read Over the Woodward Wall by a Deborah Baker, who is actually Seanan Maguire. Now this is actually a book that is featured in Middlegame, and it's actually referenced and quoted quite a bit. So what we have here is the alchemist before Reed actually wrote her findings into a children's novel so that alchemists in the future could read it and interpret it the way that she wanted them to in order to find out what she was planning. And so because Seanan Maguire had basically written it into a book anyway, she decided to go ahead and publish it. This was such a fun audiobook. I feel like I connected to this one a lot better. It's very Alice in Wonderland-esque. We have two children who are polar opposites, and one day on their way to school they are faced with a wall. They decide to climb over it and they find themselves in the up and under, which is essentially Wonderland. And it just says here, on an unplanned detour from home to school one morning, Avery and Zib find themselves climbing over a stone wall into the up and under, an impossible land with mystery, adventure and the strangest creatures. And they must find themselves and each other if they are also to find their way out and back to their own lives. This is part of a series. I believe that there are 2 books currently out. I don't know if there are more on the way, but I had a really good time with this one. Again though, I did give it 3 stars. I feel like it was fine, but it was nothing mind-blowing. I had a good time listening to it. I really enjoyed the comparisons to Alice in Wonderland because that is one of my favourite stories. But whereas Middlegame was too confusing, I feel like this one didn't have enough plot for me. So apparently I can't win, but I am glad I read it. It definitely enhanced my experience after reading Middlegame. But you definitely don't have to read Middlegame to read this. I feel like this was such a fun little adventure story. It's not finished. Of course, as I mentioned, this is part of a series or a duology at least, but it was very fun. I had a good time with it. I'm glad I read it, and yeah, I think a 3-star rating is fair. I will probably read the next book, however I don't own it physically, but it is on Scribd as an audiobook again, so I will try and pick it up before the end of the year to see how these 2 characters get on, because I do really like them as characters and I want to see more of the world that they're in. Next up we have The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. This particular edition is by Mina Lima and it does contain other tales from Hans Christian Andersen as well, but I only read The Little Mermaid for this because I read it as part of Magical Hopathon, which is a Disney inspired readathon, and one of the prompts was to read a book that was older than 100 years old, and so I decided to go for The Little Mermaid because it's one of my favourite stories alongside Alice in Wonderland, and it's only about 40 odd pages, but it's beautifully illustrated throughout. It is a gorgeous edition, and of course we follow the tale of the Little Mermaid as she makes a deal with the Sea Witch in order to be transformed into a human and win the heart of the prince. Now unfortunately it doesn't go her way, and this original tale is a lot darker than what we've seen in the Disney adaptations. The Little Mermaid is really not having a good time as a human, and it's so sad to see, but as I mentioned in my vlog, I feel like even though this story is a lot darker and it's quite sad, it's also hopeful and uplifting as well. I'm not going to say too much about this one because it's so short, but I'm really glad that I read the original tale. I feel like it was a really nice way to close out the Magical Hopathon because I did watch the live action remake of The Little Mermaid as well, and guys, that's one of my new favourite films ever. I absolutely love it, and so reading the story that it was based off and then diving straight on into that, no pun intended, was a really cool experience, and I'm glad that I did do that. So I haven't really given this one a rating. If I was to rate it, I'd probably give it 3 stars just because it's such a short story, and again I would like to see more from it, but as an older story I think it is really well done. It's popular cult film that was filmed at this location, and the workers here are tasked with scaring all of the guests. So it's essentially like a horror walkthrough if you've been to any of those. I have, and they have been terrifying because the actors are allowed to grab you and scream at you and restrain you and all that jazz. So it's very interesting to see it done in this book because they're just having such a good time with it. That is until the last weekend of the season when a few of these workers go missing, because of course this then takes a darker turn, and when one of them is found dead, Charity's role as the final girl starts to become all too real. And then it just says here, if Charity and her girlfriend Bezzy hope to survive the night, they'll need to figure out what the killer is after. But as they unravel the bloody history of the real Mirror Lake, Charity discovers that there may be more to the story than she ever suspected. Now, you guys know I'm not one for horror, however, I really enjoyed this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was such a fast-paced read, and I would say that it's fun at some points, but of course it's also also very scary because of the high stakes element to it. We are in an isolated setting. We have a killer on the loose who seems to be targeting the workers at this camp, and it's not just a matter of killing these people, it's a matter of performing rituals on the body as well. So the bodies are not treated well, that's all I'll say. You can imagine from a horror book what some of those things could be, but yeah, things are done to the bodies that were definitely disgusting, and it was very interesting to see why it was being done. I will say, I feel like the characters at some points were so stupid. One night after some of the workers disappear, our main character wakes up in the middle of the night and hears thumping and splashes, and then she looks out the window and she sees someone by the lake. Now, in my brain, if I woke up and I saw someone by the lake and I heard a splash and my fellow co-workers had gone missing, I would get the hell out of there. I would phone the police and I wouldn't look back. But they're just like, oh, it just must be a trick of the light. These people must have just gone and left everything here. It's annoying, but it's fine. We'll just carry on with the rest of the season. And then even when they know they're in danger, they still decide to split up and go and investigate. And I'm just like, bro, what are you doing? One of these characters even loves horror films and they're like, oh, you know, we should never split up, and then they just still decide to split up, and I'm like, ugh, okay, fine. So I feel like that was one of the aspects that I didn't enjoy the most, and so maybe that's why my rating is a little bit lower. As well as that, whilst I did like the ending, I also didn't like the ending. There was something about it that just didn't quite sit right with me. But all in all, this is a fantastic YA horror. I would highly recommend it if you guys are wanting to get into horror but aren't sure where to start. For me, this was perfect. I'm really happy that I read it, and it is definitely one that will keep you guessing because it does have a few plot twists. The next book I read for the readathon was Long Live the Pumpkin Queen by Shea Earnshaw, and this book takes place after the events of the Nightmare Before Christmas film. If you guys aren't aware, in the Nightmare Before Christmas we follow Jack Skellington, who is the king of Halloween Town. However, he is experiencing some inner turmoil. He loves being the Pumpkin King, but he also feels like there should be more to his world than just Halloween. And so one day when he is out in the forest, he stumbles upon some doors, and these doors take him to different holiday celebrations, and he falls in love with Christmas Town and decides to kidnap Santa Claus and take over Christmas, essentially. Now, as you can imagine, this doesn't go to plan, it doesn't go well, and he has to find a way to fix Christmas and also to fix Halloween Town. And in the middle of this, he meets Sally, who is a ragdoll, and they quickly fall in love. Now, in this book we follow Sally after she is crowned Pumpkin Queen, and she is essentially feeling the same way as Jack did in that first film. She's feeling a bit lost, she's a bit scared, she is feeling the pressure of being queen because there are so many new expectations on her. People that ignored her previously are now rushing to get her affections and her attention, and she's just a little bit overwhelmed. And so again, one day she is wandering through the forest trying to get away from everything in Halloween Town when she stumbles upon a hidden door that has never been seen before. This one has a crescent moon on it. She is very intrigued, and so she does go ahead and tries to open it, and at that point Zero, who is a really cute ghost dog, ends up biting her arm, and it comes off because she is a ragdoll, and so he kind of runs away with her arm and she follows him to get it back, and unbeknownst to her, she has left the door open. This door is actually connected to Dreamtown, and by leaving it open, Sally has released the Sandman into Halloween Town and the other realms, and he puts them all to sleep, and so it's up to her to figure out how to stop this man and to set everything right. Now, I really like The Nightmare Before Christmas. It is a film that I do tend to rewatch every year, but unfortunately this book just didn't really do it for me. I did give it 3 stars because it was what it said on the tin. It was a book about Sally, and yeah, we follow her as she comes to terms with being queen. I just felt like this was very simply written. Even though I should be familiar with the characters and the setting, I found myself just not caring about what was going on. I was invested in Sally's background, and we see some more of her history and her origins, and that was really interesting. But apart from that, I just feel like I couldn't really care less, and I feel like I didn't need to read this book. It didn't really give me that much extra knowledge except for Sally's background, which I appreciated. But but if it wasn't for the fact that I was reading it for a readathon and that it's only a short book, I say that it's 300 pages, but it flew by, so I didn't mind the fact that I wasn't enjoying it that much because I knew I would get it done quite quickly. I just didn't gel with it, guys. I feel like you don't need to read this book, but if you're a lover of Nightmare Before Christmas, as a lot of people are, then I can see why you'd enjoy this. And I did go on Goodreads and a lot of people have rated this 5 stars, which is completely fine, but for me it just let me down and I probably won't be rereading this one. And you'll be pleased to know that I have finally made it to the last book. I feel like I was doing so well at keeping my reviews concise, but I've been filming for about 40 minutes, so maybe not. But the last book I read was Misery by Stephen King, and this is the book where I read half of it because I did start it in October, however I did finish it in November. So I did include it here because I did read the majority of it in October, and it is another horror book that I wanted to speak about in this wrap up. For this one I will read you the synopsis just because I feel like even though it's quite easy to explain, I don't want to over explain it and spoil things. So it says, Paul Sheldon used to write for a living. Now he's writing to stay alive. Misery Chastain is dead. Paul Sheldon has just killed her. With relief, with joy. Misery made him rich. She was the heroine of a string of bestsellers, and now he wants to get on to some real writing. That's when the car accident happens, and he wakes up splintered and in pain in the remote mountain home of his rescuer, Annie Wilkes. The good news is that Annie was a nurse and has pain-killing drugs. The bad news is that she has long been Paul's #1 fan, and when she finds out what Paul has done to Misery, she doesn't like it. She doesn't like it at all. Now, I actually watched the film of this when I was way too young to do so. It's one that stayed with me ever since because it genuinely traumatized me. Kathy Bates as Annie is just the perfect casting ever. She is terrifying, and so whilst I was reading this I was picturing her as our main character. What's interesting about this novel is that for the majority of it we are set in one room and we are with 2 characters. That's it, but somehow it manages to keep you so engaged, and I didn't feel like it dragged at all, and I honestly forgot that we were only focusing on 2 characters. Now, I wasn't quite sure on my rating, but I do think I'm gonna give it 4 stars. I really did like this one. I definitely feel like it was long and I feel like some bits could have been cut out, but apart from that, the suspense in here was just brilliant. The body horror as well was something that threw me off to begin with, but it's just so effective. The way it's done, it just keeps building and building and you don't know what's going to happen next because Annie is so unpredictable. She's on a high 1 minute and then she's in a depressive episode the next, and when she gets in her depressive episodes there is no limit to what she will do, and it is actually terrifying. She can literally go from 0 to 100 in a split second, and so to see the way that she escalated and to see the way that she spiraled by the end was so well done. It was so creepy, and even though she's done some awful things, Stephen King somehow manages to make you feel sorry for her as well, and if that isn't good writing, I don't know what is. I feel like it was such a well done book. It's such a terrifying concept, isn't it? And especially in here where, again, it's an isolated setting. Paul crashes in the middle of nowhere in the middle of a snowstorm, and so he knows that he's not going to be found for a while because his car is stuck under some snow. Annie lives in the middle of nowhere, and by the time that his car will probably be discovered after the snow melts, all traces of him will be gone. And so I think that is one of the most terrifying things, is that he knows that there's really no one there to find him, and so we see him try to deal with that. We see him come to terms with the fact that he probably isn't getting out of this alive, and so he needs to be very smart in how he goes about his day-to-day life now with Annie. And yeah, it's just very interesting to see the dynamic between these 2. It's interesting to see how they pick up on different aspects of each other and know when they're in a mood or when they're in pain. And yeah, I just really did appreciate that. It is definitely a scary one, but it's a good book if you want to get into Stephen King. This is my first ever Stephen King novel, and I'm really glad that I decided to read this one because even though it's a story that I am familiar with because I watched the film, I'm actually glad that that was the case, because in a way I knew what was going to happen, but it did happen differently in this book. There were some scenes that were just escalated completely, and I can understand why they wouldn't put those in the film. So If you want the real misery story, then I would highly recommend you read this book. We also do get Misery's story throughout this as well, the actual fictional character that Paul is writing, and that is interesting as well because it does kind of tie into what's going on with Paul and Annie. So all in all, it was a very creepy read. I'm glad that I read it though. It did take me a little longer than I wanted it to, but as I mentioned, I read the majority of it this month and I wanted to include it in this wrap up because of that, and also because it meant that this month was one of my best reading months. Look at the amount of books I read, you guys. Considering at the start of the month I was only reading about 3 or 4 books a month, this is fantastic. I'm so proud of myself. There are so many good books in here. I really did enjoy each and every single one. There were a few, as I mentioned, that weren't completely to my taste, but I'm glad I read them. I'm glad I experienced the story, and yeah, I've gotten through a bunch of books off of my physical TBR. Please do let me know your spoiler-free thoughts on any of these books if you have read them. I love chatting to you guys about the books that I've read, and I feel like it's so nice to be able to discuss these stories, so please go ahead and do that if you do have any thoughts. In terms of the emoji of the video, I think I'm going to ask you for a pumpkin or anything related to Halloween. With this month being October, I of course read a lot of Halloween-esque books. A lot of them were horrors and were darker books, and I feel like those types of emojis would sum up this video very well. I really did enjoy diving into some books that I otherwise wouldn't have read, and I did enjoy doing a 24-hour readathon for Halloween as well. So if you don't have anything in particular that you would like to say but you would like to let me know that you're still here, please go ahead and comment that emoji now. As well as that, please don't forget to click the like button if you like this video and the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content from me. But that is it for me today, guys. Thank you once again for watching. It truly does mean the world to me, and I will see you soon in my next video. Goodbye!